The next portion of Model Context Protocol that we're going to investigate is the client. The purpose of the client is to provide a means of communication between your server and a MCP server. This client is going to be your access point to all the tools implemented by that server. Now, MCP is transport agnostic. This is a fancy term that just says that the client and the server can communicate over a variety of different protocols. A very common way to run a MCP server right now is on the same physical machine as the MCP client. And if these two things are running on the same machine, then they can communicate over standard input-output. And that's what we are going to be setting up later on inside this section. There are, however, other ways we can connect the MCP client with the MCP server. So they can also connect over HTTP or WebSockets or any of a number of other varieties or techniques. Once a connection has been formed between the client and the server, they communicate by exchanging messages. The exact messages that are allowed are all defined inside of the MCP spec. Some of the message types that you and I are going to be focusing are the list tools request and the list tools result. As you guessed, list tools request is sent from the client to the server, and it asks the server to list out all the different tools that it provides. The server would then respond with a list tools result message, which contains a list of all the different tools that it can provide. Two other common message types that you and I are going to see are the call tool request and call tool result. The first will ask the server to run a tool with some particular arguments, and the second will contain the result of the tool run. Now, at this point in time, we've got this idea of a server and a client, but I suspect it's probably not really clear how all this stuff really works together. So here's what we're going to do in the remainder of this video. We are going to walk through an example call between a lot of different things. So this will be kind of an involved process, but we're going to imagine the communication that goes on between a user, our server that we're putting together, a MCP client, the MCP server, GitHub as some provider that we're trying to access some data from, and Claude. So let's get to it, again, step by step. First thing we would expect to happen is a user to submit some kind of query or question to our server, like what repositories do I have? At this point, it would be up to our server to make a request off to Claude. But in that request, we want to list out all the different tools that Claude has access to. So before our server can make the request off to Claude, it's first going to go through a little side detour through the MCP client and the server. So here's what happens. The server is going to realize that it needs to see a list of tools to send off to Claude along with the user's query. So it's going to ask the MCP client to get a list of tools. The MCP client, in turn, is going to send a list tools request off to the server, and the server will respond with a list tools result. Now that our MCP client has a list of the tools, it will give that list of tools back to the server. And now our server has everything it needs to make an initial request off to Claude. It has both the original message from the user and a list of tools to include. So our server can make a request off to Claude with that query and the set of tools. Claude is going to take a look at the tools and realize, you know what, in order to answer the user's original question right here, I really want to call a tool. So Claude would respond with some tool use message part. At this point, our server is going to realize that Claude wants to run a tool. But our server is no longer really in charge of executing any tools. Instead, our tools are going to be executed by the MCP server. So in order to run the tool that Claude is asking for, our server is going to ask the MCP client to run a tool with some particular arguments that were provided by Claude. The MCP client, however, doesn't actually run the tool. It's going to send a call tool request off to the MCP server. The MCP server will receive that request and make a follow-up request off to GitHub. So this is where we would actually be getting a list of repositories that belong to this particular user. GitHub would respond with that list of repositories. Then the MCP server would wrap up that data inside of a call tool result and send that back to the MCP client. Then the MCP client in turn would hand the result off to our server. Now our server has the list of repositories and it can make a follow-up request to Claude with the tool result part inside of a user message. So this tool result would include the list of repositories that Claude was asking for. And now Claude has all the information it needs to formulate a final response. So it'll write out some text of something like your repositories are, and then send that back to our server, and our server would send it on back to our user. All right, so this flow, yes, it is rather complicated. The reason I want to show you this is that we are going to see all these different pieces as you and I start to implement our own custom MCP client and MCP server a little bit later on.